So let's talk about factor two. So factor two, you have the DOT audits, the driver roster. In the DOT audits, the first thing that they look for is your driver roster. That's the list of drivers that have been active over the last 12 months. That is kind of everything. If you don't have an active driver roster, then you have a problem. And I've seen tons of times where I go into a carrier and they don't even know who their drivers are. And I know it's crazy to think of, but a lot of companies don't actually know who's driving their vehicles. They're either too big or they're too spread out. They have too many locations all over the country and they just don't know what's going on. So have an accurate driver roster. Who's been driving your trucks over the last 12 months? Because that's the first thing that they're going to start with. Making sure the written drug and alcohol testing program, they're going to check for the proper content in your drug and alcohol testing program. So in your policies, a lot of people think that you can have like a 3-page policy for your drug and alcohol testing policy. That's not true. Your drug and alcohol testing policy has to meet the requirements in parts 382. And if they do not meet those requirements, then you don't have a valid drug and alcohol testing policy. So you can see those in parts 382. I have another session that actually goes just strictly over drug and alcohol testing, the policies, the procedures, things like that. But they are going to look at your drug and alcohol testing policy. Another thing that they're going to ask for is supervisor reasonable drug and alcohol suspicion. So reasonable suspicion drug and alcohol training for the supervisors, they're going to want to see their certificates. They're going to ask you, who's your supervisors? They're going to kind of look at the list. Basically, anybody that has control over what your driver does on a day-to-day basis, that's a supervisor. So any of those people, back in the day, back in the early 90s, whenever I first got audited, and that's kind of how I started my career in this whole mess of DOT compliance, was back then, one supervisor being trained in reasonable suspicion was sufficient. Now, pretty much any supervisor has to be trained in reasonable suspicion drug and alcohol training. So they have to have that supervisor reasonable suspicion training, and they have to have a certificate. One thing about that certificate, you only have to take that class once. So all those companies saying that your certificate's expired, your training's expired, they're full of it. You only have to do that reasonable suspicion training one time. I do recommend every few years kind of taking another class just to update yourself. There might be changes in the rules. There's new issues. It's not just about DOT drugs and alcohol that they say you have to do. There's a ton of drugs that come up, and so getting refreshers, but it's not required. If you can show them, they're going to ask for those certificates. If you can show them those certificates, then they're going to move on from there. They're going to ask for the agreement with your consortium, your TPA consortium, or internal method of random selection. So they want to know that you are not putting everybody's name in a hat and pulling it from a hat, basically, is what they want to know. It has to be a scientific method. So either maybe you do pull your randoms. There's tons of random number generators online that you can do if you want to do it in-house. I highly recommend you use a third-party agent or a consortium because it's cleaner, especially in litigation. That it's cleaner whenever it's a third party doing it. If you want to do it in-house and you want to run your own consortium, that's perfectly okay, perfectly legal. You can do that as long as you're using a scientific method to pull those drivers that are getting pulled, and as long as you're doing that properly. You know, it's only DOT drivers in that pool. The supervisor is not included in that pool. He's in his own separate pool. Things like that, which we have a session to go over stuff like that. But I will say best practice is to have a third party do it because it's cleaner during litigation, is the simple answer. So another thing that they actually go through is the quarterly testing summaries. So we're talking about the drug and alcohol stuff. They're looking at which drivers got pulled for each quarter. Most companies pull quarterly. So I'm going to say it's quarterly testing summaries, but if you pull monthly, if you pull your random selection every month, that's fine. You can do it weekly if you want to. I don't know anybody that would want to, but you know, most companies either do monthly, but for the most part, everybody's doing it quarterly unless you're a really large company. So quarterly testing is pretty standard. You do have to pull these random selections. I would say at least every quarter. There is a rule that says it has to be spread evenly throughout the year. So quarterly is pretty standard. So I would stick with at the very least quarterly. They're going to look at your drug and alcohol test results. They're going to look at your MIS summary from the drug and alcohol testing company, and they're going to make sure everything kind of matches and looks the same. So they're going to look at your summary. They're going to see how many tests were done overall for the previous year. They're going to say, okay, did anybody test positive? You know, and they're going to look down the list of that MIS summary, and they're going to look at the different things just to make sure that you're meeting the minimum requirements. So that you're meeting either the 25 or 50% drug and the 10% alcohol, depending on where you're at. But for right now, it's 25% drugs, 10% alcohol. Drug and alcohol test results, the driver qualification files. They actually get into your driver qualification files pretty heavily. They spend a lot of time on those. I would say the most time that they spend is typically on driver qualification files and hours of service. So they're going to start looking at your driver qualification files. They're going to look to see if you have a system to ensure compliance with expiring documents. So do you have some kind of system in place? How do you know when their medical card expires? How do you know when their driver qualification MVRs are due, their annual reviews? How do you know when these expirations? So some companies, they use a software like DOT Ready. Some companies actually do it on a spreadsheet. You know, some companies have a whiteboard with Post-it notes all over it. Whatever your system may be, as long as the DOT can see that it works for you, is fine. Most companies, more and more companies are moving to a digital format like DOT Ready though. So drug and alcohol educational material. So are you training your drivers on drug and alcohol? Are you training your supervisors, again, on drug and alcohol? Drug and alcohol training material and educational material that you should be given to your drivers. And they're also going to look for that drug and alcohol policy receipt. Every single driver who is basically a CDL driver that's operating CDL required vehicles has to have a drug and alcohol policy receipt signed, and in their driver qualification file, they're going to look for those. And then entry-level driver training. They're going to look to see drivers, especially if drivers have less than 12 months of experience, they're going to look to see, did that driver complete entry-level driver training? They're going to check to see hours of service, pre and post-trip inspections, entry-level driver training, hazmat training. With hazmat, there's 4 to 5 different trainings that are required to be done within 90 days of employment if you have hazmat, placardable hazmat. So if you're a hazmat carrier, make sure that you have all 4 to 5 trainings done within 90 days, and then you have to do it every 3 years. So on the ELDTs, the entry-level driver training, that the rules are changing in 2020, and we have a whole other session just going over that. So, but they're going to look at stuff like that. So.